You know the law. It seems so permanent, doesn't it? Like it's etched in stone. But what if I told you that the rule book that governs our lives is actually more like a live document? One that's constantly being edited and rewritten, not by lawmakers in some stuffy room, but by all of us. Today we're diving deep into how society itself rewrites the law.
It's a pretty fascinating question when you stop to think about it. Are laws really written in stone, or are they more like words written in sand, where the changing tides of society can just wash them away and reshape them completely? As we're about to see, the law is actually incredibly fluid, and it has to be, because it's constantly responding to huge shifts in our values, our beliefs, and even our technology.
All right, so here's the plan. We'll kick things off with a big picture idea. Then we'll get into how deep cultural changes have reshaped equal rights. After that, we'll look at how public opinion can create waves that change the law, how immigration changes a nation's legal needs, and finally, how technology is always in a race with the rulebook.
So the key idea here is this. There's a constant feedback loop between the way we live our lives and the laws we make. It's pretty simple, really. As our values change, pressure starts to build on the legal system to catch up, and that pressure leads to new policies and protections. Let's start with one of the biggest drivers of change, our culture.
This is where we see some of the most massive changes. When a society's fundamental beliefs about what's fair, what equality means, and what individual freedom looks like, when those things shift, the law almost always follows.
A really powerful example of this is the fight for LGBT+ rights. I mean, it is just staggering to think that as recently as the 16th century, homosexual acts were punishable by death. The journey from that, a capital crime, to a celebrated identity is just a profound story of how culture and law transform each other, all pushed forward by incredibly brave activists who demanded the change.
In this timeline, it shows you exactly how that legal change happened, step by step. Look at the starting point, that 1957 Wolfenden report. It basically argued that the law shouldn't be getting involved in people's private morality. 10 years later, that leads to decriminalization. And from there, you can literally trace the path towards full equality. It's a legal journey for sure, but it's fueled by a huge cultural shift, a growing belief in individual rights.
Of course, a similar, and maybe even longer struggle was the one for women's rights. The suffragette movement basically threw down a challenge to the fundamental belief that a woman's place was only in the home. They demanded a voice in the very laws that govern their lives.
And you know what? Their fight led to absolutely massive victories. Getting the vote in 1918 was just the beginning. That one change opened the door for everything that came later, like the Equal Pay Act in 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975. These laws basically put into writing the idea that a woman's value in society was equal to a man's.
Okay, this slide shows one of the most dramatic turnarounds you can imagine. On the one hand, you have this horrifying old principle, the rule of thumb, which, it essentially gave permission for domestic violence. And then you have today, with proactive laws like Clare's Law from 2014, which is all about giving people the power and the information to protect themselves. It is a complete 180.
So, big cultural tides can be slow-moving. But what happens when a sudden crisis creates a tidal wave of public opinion? Well, sometimes that's exactly what it takes to force the law to change, and to change fast.
Let's talk about drink driving. Back in the 1950s, it just wasn't seen as that serious of a crime. It was sort of brushed off. But that casual attitude had a devastating cost, leading to thousands and thousands of deaths on the roads every single year.
And the problem was only getting worse. Just a decade later, that number had jumped to 8,000 deaths a year. The public, the media, policymakers, they just couldn't ignore the carnage anymore. The whole perception of drink driving was shifting from a minor mistake to a deadly, antisocial act. The tipping point finally came from two things: huge public pressure and a bit of new technology. The 1967 Road Safety Act set a clear legal limit, and the brand new breathalyzer gave the police a scientific, undeniable way to enforce it. The results were immediate, and they were dramatic. It saved thousands of lives.
We see a really similar story with smoking. What was once seen as glamorous became a full-blown public health crisis. It all started with scientific research in the 50s, then public awareness campaigns and growing concern led to a whole cascade of laws, from warning labels in '65 all the way to outright bans in public spaces and even in cars with kids.
But maybe the most profound shift in public opinion was the one around the death penalty. And this wasn't just some abstract debate about morality. This was about shocking, tragic miscarriages of justice, like the executions of Timothy Evans and Derek Bentley, that made the public really question the finality of capital punishment.
The public outcry from these cases directly fueled the movement to abolish it, and you can trace the step-by-step retreat of the state's ultimate power right here on this timeline. From a temporary ban in '65 to a permanent one for murder in '69, and finally, its complete abolition in 1998, which was done to align with human rights conventions.
A country's laws, at the end of the day, have to reflect its people. So, what happens when the people themselves change? When the demographics of a nation shift, the law has no choice but to adapt to protect everyone in that new multicultural society. In the UK, post-war immigration, especially the arrival of the Windrush generation from the Caribbean, fundamentally changed the country's makeup. Now, this created a much more vibrant and diverse society, but it also exposed some really deep-seated racism and discrimination that the old laws just weren't equipped to handle at all. This created urgent social problems that needed fixing.
But over time, as society became more integrated, attitudes slowly started to change. This data here shows a pretty significant drop in self-admitted prejudice over just 30 years. And that cultural shift, which was partly a result of public opinion demanding better, is what created the political will to finally pass stronger anti-discrimination laws.
And here's that legal framework being built, basically brick by brick. The 1965 Act was a huge first step, but it was limited. A decade later, the 1976 Act went much further, and it started tackling the more subtle, indirect kinds of discrimination. And then finally, the 2010 Equality Act pulled everything together, creating one powerful piece of legislation to protect against all kinds of discrimination.
All right, finally, let's look at the fastest-moving driver of legal change there is: technology. I mean, innovation moves at lightning speed, and a lot of the time the law is left playing a frantic game of catch-up.
The internet, it created a world without borders, and with it, a whole new playground for criminal activity. Suddenly, things like fraud, harassment, and theft could be committed anonymously from a keyboard thousands of miles away. And that posed a massive challenge for law enforcement and for legislators.
And this created entirely new categories of crime. I mean, think about it. Acts like upskirting and sharing revenge porn, they just didn't exist in the same way before everyone had a smartphone. So in response, specific new laws had to be written, like the Voyeurism Act in 2019, to explicitly outlaw these new tech-enabled violations. And this race is nowhere near over. Now lawmakers are grappling with the challenges of AI and data privacy. And this brings us right to our final thought. When you look at just how much has changed from equal rights to digital crime, it really forces you to ask, what common practice or accepted belief of today will future generations look back on with the same disbelief we feel when we hear about something like the rule of thumb? It seems the only constant really is change itself.